Bill Crane joins me now from Atlanta, Georgia. He's a political analyst and commentator. Good to see you, Bill. So, keeping it domestic, both candidates are zigzagging across key states. What's your assessment of the race so far?
Well, as we're in the final days, and early and advanced voting has brought in a record number of Americans. Over 60 million Americans have already been balloted, either in person or via absentee ballot. And although it has been for weeks kind of down to 7 states, according to some pollsters, the states of New Hampshire and Minnesota are now getting to be too close to call. I happen to live in Georgia, which is one of the 7 kind of long-standing battleground states, which are, for your audience, are Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. But if you look at places like Real Clear Polling, which is an aggregator of polls, there's a trend that's starting to develop in the state of Georgia that I'm in. As an example, 12 polls since the second week of October, Donald Trump has led each of those polls from 1.5 percentage points to 6 percentage points, with his average polling for Georgia being 2.5% ahead. Ms. Harris similarly is ahead in Wisconsin. Michigan is virtually tied. Pennsylvania is very close. So as your colleague and correspondent was speaking about, foreign policy in a state like Michigan, which does have a substantial Muslim population, folks from Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, it may matter. It may be enough to be a decisive factor.
You mentioned polling there. Some political pundits say that polling companies are being overly cautious because they got it so wrong in 2016 with Trump's win. Do you think that these polls are to be trusted here and that it is that close?
I don't trust any single poll, but when I look at 12 or 15 polls from credible, long-standing polling organizations like Quinnipiac and Trafalgar and Gallup, Harris, it's very hard to dismiss them. What did happen in 2016 and 2020, by most of the pollsters' admission, 83% got it wrong according to a CNN analysis, and in 2020, 100% got it wrong. They really underweighted Republicans in their sample, meaning they didn't have enough Republicans in there. So they build the sample at the beginning of the polling period, and they don't really recast that over the course. So if there was a flaw in the system and in the polling, it's been with us all campaign season, almost all the way back to when Joe Biden was leading before the first debate. And we won't really know if it's wrong or not until Election Day. But my sense is, looking at things on the ground, a lot of anecdotal things we don't have time to get into today, and the trends being reasonably consistent among those different pollsters who use different methodologies to build their samples. Some have 1,000 in their sample, some 1,200, some 2,000, that they've got to be reasonably within their margin of error, which in most cases is 3 to 4 percentage points.
Right. As you said, more than 60 to 70 million people have already cast their vote. Historically, early voting has favoured Democrats, but Republicans are allegedly voting early in record numbers. Is this likely to unnerve the Harris camp, do you think?
Well, what you've got going on is a couple of things. In 2020, we were in the pandemic here. So in Georgia and a lot of other states, the secretaries of states of those states mailed absentee ballot applications to every registered voter. So in Georgia, in that election, we had record use of absentee ballots and those voting boxes, the ballot boxes, the drop boxes you've probably heard so much about. This election cycle is different in that both of the parties, the main parties, and there are more than 2 candidates on this ballot, but they are very focused on their bases and turnout. And so you're seeing, as an example, Vice President Harris is here in Georgia today. Former President Trump will be here in Georgia tomorrow. They are very focused on their battlegrounds in the states they need to win. Ms. Harris will spend the balance of the election period in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Mr. Trump will be in Wisconsin, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. He seems to think he's got Georgia in the bag. The Harris campaign did recently pull back a media buy by about 2/3 in the state of North Carolina and move some of their staff off out of the ground there, which would tell you, looking at it anecdotally, they think that their internal polling has told them they don't have North Carolina.
There was a strong honeymoon period with the Harris campaign when she first became the candidate. It seems that Trump's now neck and neck in line with her. Trump has been telling people at his rallies that a Harris government would ruin the US economy. Do you think that the Harris-Walz campaign has done enough to drum their economic policy, something that voters across the divide are very concerned about?
There's things they can't control. The most recent jobs report for the entire country came out day before yesterday, and it was only 16,000 jobs. A president can impact that, but certainly can't fix those numbers after the fact. I think the Harris campaign bet too much on hope and joy as messaging, positive view of America, to carry them through the election, and didn't have answers to some questions that seemed logical that they would have answers for. I watched half a dozen interviews with the vice president in the last couple of weeks where she was specifically asked two questions that seemed pretty straightforward. When did you know that President Biden was slipping in terms of his cognition and abilities? And the answer to that typically has been, I was with him in the Situation Room, I was with him in the Oval Office, he's very with it, Joe Biden is on top of his game. And then the follow-up to that is, well, if that's true, why are you in the race? And that second question was very difficult to answer, other than saying, well, I'm a different person, and I'm obviously not Joe Biden. And I think it fed a discernment of perhaps being disingenuous with some of the answers. The other thing I think we're seeing is with early voting starting, the undecideds were already in single digits, and they are deciding. And the pollsters tell us again, independent voters are breaking about 10 percentage points higher with Donald Trump. And I think there were a lot of Nikki Haley Republicans sitting on the fence who hadn't decided, who in the end have decided to cast a GOP ballot for those down ticket races like the U.S. Senate, where the GOP looks very good, or the U.S. House, where it's a much harder stretch, but there are 6 contested races in California and New York, 2 deeply blue states that are contested, that are competitive. And if half of those 12 seats in California and New York happen to go Republican, the GOP retains control of the House.
Now, that actually leads me to my last question. Can you talk a little bit in terms of perhaps more layman's terms for our international viewers about how these votes do affect the Senate in particular, and what that means in terms of, you know, the U.S. vice president or the U.S. president to be what they can achieve in office?
So in our system, you have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. For a president to carry forward major initiatives, the budget, new programs, he needs the support of Congress, which is oftentimes divided, not always the party that the president is. But if he has one chamber, whether it's the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House, it is possible for compromise and to get legislation passed that the president then signs into law. So right now in the United States, we have a Republican Congress, U.S. House, and a Democratic Senate controlled by 2 votes. It's a 100-person body. It is currently 51-49, with 4 independents caucusing on the Democratic side. There are 8 contested seats in 8 battleground states, similar to the battleground states of the presidential race. And in those states, 2 of those states, West Virginia, which is not a presidential battleground, Donald Trump won by 40 percentage points in 2020. Joe Manchin, the well-known and well-regarded retiring Democrat, doesn't have as strong a successor candidate, and it looks like Jim Justice, the Republican governor of West Virginia, who switched parties the day after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, will be the next senator from West Virginia. There's also a pretty easy pickup looking like Montana, where Senator John Tester, a longtime Democrat, is running ads speaking to Trump policies that he supports. So he knows he's in trouble there, and if the GOP just wins those 2 races, they pick up the majority in the U.S. Senate. And even though the vice president is the presiding officer in the Senate, you don't need that vote unless you have a tie. So with those 2 races and probably a few more, it looks like the GOP will take the U.S. Senate.
All right, we'll be watching with bated breath. Bill Crane, really appreciate your time.
Take care.